Okay, this is the 30-second bell. If you can all begin to get seated, we can begin. Wow, that was a good response. Okay, well, the first thing I have to tell you is that I am not Edward Lucas. Edward, who unfortunately has lost his voice. So you're going to have to make do with me. Who am I? A very existential question I always ask myself every day. I am Brooks Newmark. I was a partner at a big private equity firm called Apollo for about 15 years. I then was a member of parliament for 10 years, including being on the Treasury Select Committee for 4 years, a government whip, and a minister for civil society. And in 2015, I left politics, and now I sit in a minor university called Oxford University in the politics department, and I do a little bit of lecturing on the side at Said Business School in private equity. So the subject at hand is the end of globalization looming ahead? And I'm tempted to ask our guests, is Francis Fukuyama's The End of History as irrelevant, really, as Tom Friedman, The World is Flat? That we thought life was changing, but in the end it wasn't. So the tension is, there has been a reaction. We've seen the rise of Trump, we've seen Brexit, we've seen the rise of Le Pen, Wilders, the elections in Germany recently, and we've seen the rise of populism. And is this a step change, really, in the change of globalization or not? I have this image in my head of President Trump, like King Canute in Britain in 1028, who placed his throne on the shores of the United Kingdom and told the waves to stop coming. Unfortunately, the waves did not stop coming. That tends to be my view of globalization, but maybe our guests have a very different opinion of that, and I look forward to hearing from them. Briefly, those of you, pretty much everybody here will know Valdis, who is currently the Vice President of the Euro and Social Dialogue and is in charge of financial stability, financial services, and capital markets. Sergei Gurlev is Chief Economist of the EBRD. Michael Stummo is I think, going to be Trump's representative on Earth here as the CEO of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. Perhaps, perhaps not. Let's see.
We'll see.
And Martin Gauss is chairman of the board of AirBaltic, and he's going to explain to me that following Brexit, when I checked into AirBaltic on the way here, there was no United Kingdom, Great Britain, or England for me to register my passport, which was hugely disappointing. So, first of all, I'd like to begin with Valdis. And I guess, like all politicians, you'll probably talk with whatever you want to talk about, but my question to you, at least, is that following Britain's exit from the EU, is it going to be easier for the eurozone and the EU in general to accelerate political, economic, and financial integration? And is that going to be beneficial to the EU in the face of globalization?
One thing I can tell on this, that it has helped to concentrate minds. Indeed, after Brexit referendum, EU had to look and decide, so what is the way forward? That is what was happening in Bratislava summit, where the agreement was that the remaining 27 countries see EU as indispensable and are determined to make a success. And it's later reflected in Commission's White Book on future of the EU and accompanying reflection papers. So right now we are basically finishing the stage of reflection, and from the Commission side we are now thinking that it's time to come to some more concrete decisions. So we had discussions discussing 5 different scenarios for future of EU, maybe somehow mixing those scenarios, developing 6th scenario. But we think that towards the end of the year, now we should be coming with some decisions. From our side, we'll be coming with a package on completing the economic and monetary union, so mainly to do with the future of eurozone, and we expect for discussions also at the European summit on what is a way forward. So it's certainly a development which we believe is not helping neither EU nor UK, but at least it's now helped us to concentrate minds and think more seriously where we really want to head.
Okay. Sergej, the Eurozone, at least those of us who are on the Brexiteer side of the argument, perceived at least very little growth in the Eurozone over pretty much the past decade. Yes, recently there has been a blip upwards, but growth certainly, particularly if you take out Germany and the UK, has been negative for all intents and purposes, certainly until the past year, over a period of a decade. Is the solution to that going to be more regulation and more protectionism when it comes to the Eurozone dealing with the threat of globalization and the outside world?
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm not a politician, and I'll try to answer your question. As you asked it, I think part of the regulation within the EU is actually to create a single market. And today we have a summit on a digital economy in Tallinn. And this is a very challenging issue. If you want to create a knowledge-based innovation economy, you need to generate economies of scale. And for that, you need to resolve this difficult trade-off, for example, between privacy and security on one hand, and innovation scale on the other hand. Without creating a single market for innovation, for knowledge-based products, it's very hard to imagine that Europe will be at par with the United States, which enjoys those benefits. So in some cases, regulation is actually pro-trade, pro-integration. And I think that is indeed the way forward. And if you're asking whether protectionism in general is a good idea, the answer from an economist working in a bank which is committed to market economics, inclusive globalization, private entrepreneurship, of course the answer is no. But if you're asking if globalization without regulation will always deliver, will always be supported by people in all countries, the answer is much more nuanced. We see that in many cases, globalization creates losers, and it's very hard to compensate losers. And unless we manage to create policies where those left behind are compensated, and not just with money, but with careers and opportunities in the future, with access to public goods, with the understanding that the system is fair and works for them. And if you ask for concrete solutions, I can talk about that for some time. But basically, inclusive globalization is the only way globalization is going to be sustainable. And some regulation for that, of course, is required. But protectionism is definitely a way backward, and not to fair society, but to crony capitalism. In our region, we see that. Some countries favor protectionism that creates rents, that creates special interests. Those special interests use their rents to dominate politics and create closed societies which will not result in prosperity, which already do not deliver to their citizens either. So I think the way forward is not protectionism, but inclusive globalization. Okay,
but you know, we have certainly witnessed in the EU an enormous rise in unemployment, and unemployment that has been double-digit for quite a while. When it comes to youth unemployment, particularly in areas such as Spain and Portugal and other southern European economies, the youth unemployment has been as high as 40 or even 50% at one stage. You know, how is the EU going to deal with those challenges? Because, you know, if we've seen the rise of populism, and people don't have jobs, and particularly young people who don't have jobs or find it difficult to see a future for them, how is the EU going to deal with that challenge going forward?
That's a very good question. I actually have a paper called exactly European Trust Deficit and Rise of Populism. And basically we show that not just in countries, but in subnational regions that experience higher increase of unemployment during the crisis, these are the regions which vote for populist parties. And without addressing inflexibility of labor markets, without opening up opportunities for younger people, it's very hard to hope that populism will be constrained. And there are countries in the EU which don't have double-digit unemployment. There are actually countries and regions in the EU where unemployment today is lower than before the crisis. And in that sense, there are places where you can look for solutions. And I think that's the way forward. The difficulty is that for the reforms, you need the trust of the public that politicians are working for you. And what has happened during the crisis, especially in those countries which you mentioned where unemployment went up, especially youth unemployment went up, we also observe and document the loss of trust in national and European political institutions. And that makes it difficult to carry out those structural reforms that are mentioned in the reflection papers.
Okay, I could say that the UK, of course, has been a model following austerity and bringing down unemployment, which is now, I think, around 3% or between 3 and 3.5%. So perhaps the EU could look at the UK's approach towards resolving economic problems. I won't ask for an answer there. Okay, Michael, the rise of Trump. There's certainly a perception out there that his whole America First strategy means that the US is going to retrench, is no longer going to be a liberal, open-minded economy, very much the way that sort of George Bush #2's language was, I remember when he first became president. Do you think, rather like King Canute, that the realities of the economic weather will mean he cannot stop globalization? Or do you think that he will be able to, so-called, build the wall against reality?
Right. I didn't really study up on King Canute before I came, so I can't fully answer. But we saw in the 2008 election, which gave rise to Obama being in his first presidency, when he and Hillary were campaigning against each other, they both pledged to renegotiate NAFTA, because NAFTA has been a controversial trade agreement, a modern trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada within the U.S. It's had a lot of controversy. Obama in Ohio in 2008 said, "I will renegotiate NAFTA." He was the populist, and he and Hillary were trying to outdo each other. Of course, none of them were truly populist. Neither of them tried to do anything about it when Obama was president or Hillary was Secretary of State. And oh, by the way, I think globalization, populism, nationalism, free trade, and protectionism are lazy terms. I think they conceal more than they reveal. But in the U.S., we have seen, and I think one thing we all agree on is that income insecurity is a big cause here. In the U.S., we've seen, even as GDP grows the last 40 years, the middle class, the poor, the wage stagnation, wages as a percent of GDP has been very small. As capital is more mobile through, the global trade, but workers are not. You see cities doing pretty well, the rural areas not doing well. You see that pattern in the U.S. 2016 election, where while Hillary got the popular vote, it was very heavily concentrated in New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Everywhere else was a sea of red, red meaning went for the Republican Party. Remember that Trump took out all the free trade Republicans before he got to the general election. So I think better, globalization is a fact, but I don't think it's how we manage it is really what we need to, look at. And does it require full economic integration or just interaction among nation states? And of course, President Trump, who I am not authorized to represent here, did spark some controversy with his nation-state comments at the United Nations talk. But I think a big overlooked issue in the trade and services world is the imbalance. We have big imbalances where China is in a big trade surplus with the U.S. They overproduce, they underconsume, they export their overcapacity to the U.S. We import it, and they export their unemployment to the U.S., and we have a big trade deficit. So the imbalances among the big major economies are big issues. And in Europe, you have your own issue where Germany has too big a trade surplus, about 8.5% of GDP, where they're overproducing, underconsuming, and exporting their overcapacity to the other countries, as well as their unemployment. And the peripheral Europe is having trouble recovering. And a lot of that is a currency issue. So there's some things that the IMF and WTO have fallen down on, but we've seen the populism, so to speak, coming for a while.
Okay. I will, I guess, like to ask Martin, besides answering my question, which is why I couldn't register on AirBaltic, you run a regional airline that has seen a lot of growth. You know, reflecting on your own particular business, how has globalization, particularly in the past 2 to 3, 4 years, while we've seen this rise of populism, has it had an impact on your business? Has it not? What do you see going on through your rather sort of perhaps narrower world when it comes to transportation?
First of all, I'd like to apologize what happened to you. It's not a Brexit UK charge we introduced. It was just something which shouldn't happen. And I'll come back what happened, but the Brexit charge is to come.
It's an accidental tariff already early.
You're still flying like any other European on us, no extra charge.
That's what Mr. Barnier keeps telling us. Yeah.
And we try to keep that charge for the people from the UK very low when it actually comes to the Brexit. But on the globalization, I would say that AirBaltic is benefiting from globalization. We don't see any of the effects which were mentioned earlier because we are growing. We are growing in Europe and we are even growing in the world because we connect the Baltics to the world with a one-stop strategy. So we are the Fly Direct, where we have above 60 direct destinations, and I guess that more than 60% here in the audience came on us because that's what the figure is here in the Baltics. And but we also connect to the world with one stop. We're opening Abu Dhabi, we have Madrid, and from there you go with one stop to the world. So we're benefiting from globalization. Within Europe, you see differences in the different countries, but what we also see that the low-cost flying is very popular with young people because it is so cheap now to fly within Europe that a lot more people use that, not only for business reasons it's cheaper, but also for leisure. So we do not see that. We see the opposite. We see as more as we offer, flying we offer, as more connectivity is there to the Baltics. And we have more than 3 million people flying on us at the moment. We are a strong contributor to the Baltic GDP, the strongest here in Riga, where the aviation sector contributes 3% to the GDP. So we are important. And as more as we do, as better it is for the country. I think when people started trading, they settled at rivers, they had boats, and they were going from A to B. And if you go back, it was the connectivity then leading to globalization. So what we do as an airline, and as a national airline here, we focus on connecting the Baltics to the world, and with that, hopefully improving with globalization the GDP and the wealth of people. So we are not at all doing something which is negative. Another effect, we can buy, or we bought planes from Canada. That is no problem anymore today. So these things help us. So I would say AirBaltic is benefiting from globalization and does not see any negative aspect of it.
So really, would you say that in essence the rise of a lot of these smaller regional airlines is one of the benefits of globalization, particularly the way that they've been able to have very aggressive price points, which has made it easier for people who perhaps couldn't afford to travel before to now be able to travel? Because we're hearing a lot of the negativity of globalization, but certainly in your industry there have been a lot of benefits, certainly in the past decade.
I think Europe was lacking behind the US, where the same development which we have here happened much earlier with Southwest Airlines and other carriers. The US is also ahead of us in Europe because they have consolidated their aviation sectors. So they had all the growth coming from the low costers. Now they're consolidating more major carriers there. We here have a lot of low-cost carriers coming up, being very successful, but we also see the consolidation, and we will have also in 10 years a couple of big airlines, and the smaller ones will disappear. The flying itself will stay, and that's why, again, it's part of making this global, and we are going to do more of it, and the other airlines as well. I can't see, even in an economic downturn, that the people would not like to go from A to B. It might be less for leisure, but enabling small, medium-sized businesses to go direct to their counterparties, that will stay for the foreseeable future. That we see this as soon as we offer any destination, we always have people traveling also for business reasons to these places.
Okay. Valis, politicians should be problem solvers when they see problems out there. And there seems to be a real disconnect in the past few years because politicians, I can only talk about the UK, for example, where we seem to be doing well, we seem to have good growth, we seem to have more employment and unemployment dropping, yet we still had Brexit. We still had a populist movement that led to us coming out of the EU. There seems to be a general trend in Europe in this disconnect between politicians and the economic reality for ordinary people. So there's no point in saying, gosh, the stock market is at an all-time high, or we've had this growth or that growth, when actually the majority of people are not seeing the benefit of that. So how would you go about reconnecting that disconnect between the political class, perhaps the economic class, and ordinary people out there?
Indeed, you raised an important question, basically how to get the politics of the globalization right. Because economically, we see benefits. To give one example, every 1 billion euros of exports of the EU supports 14,000 jobs. So it's a big factor. At the same time, it's clear that many people are saying we are not feeling those benefits, if not even losing the jobs. So that's already in this year's annual growth survey, when we are setting out EU's economic policy priorities. We concentrate on priorities which can facilitate economic growth, like supporting investment, structural reforms to strengthen the competitiveness while maintaining responsible fiscal policy. We put additional emphasis on inclusive growth. So what we need to do so that the benefits of this economic growth are really felt by the societies. And there are a number of things we can do in terms of tax policy, shifting away tax burden from low-paid labor to other tax bases, on social systems, better targeting of our social systems towards indeed the more needy parts, skills agenda, lifelong learning. It's one of the key questions if you want to stay competitive in the situation of globalization, also in a situation of technological change and digitalization. It's all coming together. You cannot rely only on this classical education model when you get educated when you are young, and then it kind of suffices for a life. Now, indeed, we need much more dynamic skills system and much more emphasis of lifelong learning. People need to adjust their skills so that those skills stay relevant in the labor market. So all those elements, youth unemployment was mentioned. We have a targeted youth employment initiative and youth guarantee, where member states are working to ensure that young people which are neither in education, employment or training are getting offer to one of those avenues, that they either find a job or go back to education or find some professional training. So all those initiatives are there to ensure that we not only have economic growth, but we have inclusive economic growth.
Sergey, we're all getting older. We're going to have to work longer. There's going to be a challenge that the point that Valdis was making, that you may suddenly hit the ripe old age of, let's say, 45. You have to retrain yourself. You may be an auto worker who finds yourself out of a job, and you have to start a new job, but you may have to work now till you're 70 or 75, because people's pensions perhaps won't last long. When I was young, I think the lifespan of a coal miner was going to be something like 46. You know, now people are living longer. Therefore, we're going to have to work longer and maybe have not just one job or two jobs or three jobs. In the context of globalization, what do you then see as that challenge? Because we're at a time now where certainly when I went into the workforce almost 40 years ago, you could expect just to have one job for your whole life. I have 5 children, believe it or not. My children certainly expect to hop from job to job, you know, every 1 or 2 years. They don't expect necessarily to have a job for life. So globalization could have some benefits for them because they can quickly move from job to job and be more versatile. But those of us at the sort of back end of retirement, it's going to be a little bit more challenging. So I fear there's going to be a disconnect there. And when I look at populism and those who were voting, they tended to be the older generation, people who could not adapt to this change. So I wonder if you wish to comment on that.
Yes, I would like to, but first I would like to follow up on the question you asked Valdis to comment on, because Valdis is a modest person. He didn't mention his own story. I think it is important that when we talk about growth, inclusive growth, we also need to think about fairness and understanding that politicians are in the same boat with voters. If you have trust in politicians, if you know that politicians work together with you to go through the difficult times, you will actually support what they're doing. And Valdis's government didn't execute major austerity measures and yet won elections. Unlike some other countries where establishment parties were perceived by the voters to be disconnected, corrupt, in the pocket of interest groups, and that's where anti-establishment parties took over. Now, back to your question, and this is again to follow up on what Valdis said about lifelong learning and the auto worker changing jobs or countries at 45. I think we should not pretend that change is easy, and whoever is in the room and try to change a big organization, small organization, themselves, I don't know, self-discipline, exercise, lose weight, all these things are very, very difficult. And we shouldn't pretend that you just go, log online, take a MOOC, and you have a new job. This is not how it works. And we need to be realistic that it's not going to be easy whatever we do. Now, one particular challenge is, I think, is to engage both public and private sector in this effort. Because if governments come and tell you, you used to be an auto worker, and now I'm sure that you will be a software engineer. And then it turns out in 3 years that what you learned as a software engineer is completely automated. You want to become a paralegal, and it turns out that in 5 years, paralegal's job is automated. So it's very hard to hope that governments know exactly what labor market will be in 5 years or 10 years. And so I think it is important to build a partnership between public sector and employers who will try to at least provide some feedback on what skills are needed in the market. And that is of course, is a very important challenge. It's not something we have easily done. Now, the good news is...
But just like I would add in there, a third part of that three-legged stool, which is educational establishments.
Of course.
Because they're the ones that are going to have to step up to the plate early on and get people, I think, trained up for a new world where people have to have adaptable skills.
That's an excellent question because, and I used to run a university myself for 9 years. And I know that universities, and especially the leading universities, are extremely conservative. They're very proud of what they do, and rightly so. And not every top university wants to change. And it's very hard to discuss this change even in very constructive terms. But technology is changing. Technology is coming into educational system. And access to good professors is becoming easier and easier and cheaper even for people who are not on campus. And in that sense, I think we should be optimistic. But I won't say that it's going to be easy. Exactly for the reasons that you mentioned. It's hard to expect that it will be easy for the student to recognize the challenge and to invest in new skills. It's hard to be too optimistic about governments and employers cooperating in something that they've not really done before. And it's hard to be too optimistic about educational establishments saying, we want to change, we need to change, we want to do something we've never done before. So I think we are entering difficult times. But again, the good news is technology is coming, things are becoming more efficient, cheaper. So I think there are reasons for cautious optimism.
Michael, I guess you didn't really answer my question, but maybe I didn't articulate it well enough. Do you think that America is effectively withdrawing from engagement with the world? And is that going to be economically beneficial to the United States to effectively pull up the drawbridge when it comes to engaging with and trading with the rest of the world?
No, I don't think so.
Do you wish to elaborate?
So the U.S. has the most open economy in the world. That hasn't changed. I don't know if that's necessarily good. We don't see a good correlation between the most open economies and the best long-term sustainable growth. We have the lowest tariffs. We still do. We have no other charges. We have no value-added taxes or any other charges. Our trade facilitation, trying to get goods and services into Spain, is much harder than trying to get goods into the U.S. I just don't. I mean, I see people overreacting to what the president has said, and of course, what the president has said is designed to get attention, and it obviously does, and it worked. But I just don't understand this. The U.S. is closing off. I don't get it.
So the image of let's build a wall is purely to do with immigration and stopping more people coming in rather than lower cost of labor coming into the United States?
They might get a wall built. I don't know. That's a controversial
yeah, I think it's more symbolic than anything else. But he used the image of a wall to stop Mexicans coming across the border. I would certainly look at it as the threat of cheaper labor, which was part of the creation of populism in America, as opposed to purely one of America's full today, we don't want more immigrants.
Right. For goods and services, we're as open or more than any other country in the world. Immigration I don't deal with. But your point about labor is an interesting one, because there's a very difficult tension that if you combine, for example, the market's a high and a low wage market, through trade goods and services where people are sort of where they are, that they don't sort of move to where the jobs are. The workers are relatively immobile. The capital is mobile. What you have when you combine the markets is labor wage convergence. It just happens. So for auto, the NAFTA turned really into auto parts and automotive offshoring agreement from the U.S. perspective, whereby a lot of our auto industry went to Mexico, and we kind of liked our auto industry because there's a lot of good-paying jobs there. And but you have BMW just built a plant in northern Mexico, paying $1.50 or $2 an hour. The U.S. auto worker wage is 25, something like that. If you throw in benefits, I don't know, but you have it. If you have a convergence, which by the way there hasn't been with Mexico. Mexican wages haven't improved, but if you have the predicted convergence, you converge at, say, $12, Mexican workers are very happy. The U.S. workers are ready to throw out the government and burn down the White House. With China, there has been wage convergence because we've really integrated somewhat with China since the WTO, and the The Chinese have overproduced. They're more producers than consumers, so they overproduce, they underconsume, and they export their overcapacity to the U.S. and others, and over-rely on our consumers for growth. And that was okay for a while, but now we're getting to a point where we have such stagnation and income insecurity that's not working. But unlike Mexico, Chinese wages have gotten better. So the government has sort of kept its deal that the core deal in China is, we will repress you, but you will be employed, and your wages will increase a bit, and your children will be better off than you are. That's the core deal. If they don't keep that deal, Tiananmen...
Except a lot of those jobs in China now are being exported elsewhere to lower wage economies, which was really the whole point of Tom Friedman's book, that what you're going to get is a flattening of economies. Where we are now is that we are in the middle of that disruptive period, while some economies are still growing, while people are still on relatively low wages. If you're a middle class or lower middle class person and you want a BMW, it's going to be better to buy a BMW made in Mexico than one made in Michigan. And that's the reality. They can't have their cake and eat it, wanting highly paid jobs in America, yet at the same time having relatively inexpensive brown and white goods.
Right, so the low consumer prices side of the ledger has been one of the mistakes politicians and economists have made. You should be all happy because you get low prices from imports and an insufficient weighting of having a diverse productive capability that produces good paying jobs in rising wage levels. Korea did not grow, South Korea did not grow from an agrarian poor country in the 1960s to a modern economy in the 1990s and 2000s by trying to get cheap goods in from other countries. They focused upon building a diverse array of supply chains to build their country. Same with Japan, and same to their credit, China. And if you want to go down the cheap consumer goods route, the U.S. could have done that when we became our own country after revolting from the UK. We could have said, let's just, grow cotton and wheat and then let's buy cheaper goods from Europe. But instead, with Alexander Hamilton, with the 1789, the year of Report on Manufactures, we decided we're going to build intentionally a diverse set of supply chains and build our own economy. So it's a mistake to weight cheap consumer goods too much.
Right, okay, I could get in a further debate with you about the coal industry, but I won't. Going on to you, Martin, when it comes to sort of new technologies, and I know certainly the Baltic countries have been at the forefront, of new technologies, have you seen again, sort of through the lens with which you look, benefits of globalization in your particular part of the world here?
Yes, I'm German. I'm from Germany, so I came to the Baltics 6 years ago, and I live here now during the week for the last 6 years. I can see a difference. Everything is faster here. If there is a new technology, you normally have it here first before you have it back in Germany. What I see here is that the people working in our company on all the news we bring out, there's a different engagement, so I see that, and it enabled us actually to have the most modern and advanced airplane in service in the world at the moment. That's changing the way how jet aircraft fly from the technology. So I see this here. Why? I think because the country or the countries had the chance to start at a time when the internet was already there, and all the infrastructure is much better than it is, for example, in Germany. So I see that, and innovation here is definitely going faster than it is going back home.
I'll ask you one more question before I open it up to the floor. And if whoever controls this laptop here, where I've been logged off, could log me on so I could see who is tweeting what, and I can see what good questions our audience in the wider world is asking, I can then ask you some of those questions as well. Yeah, I think her name is Katrina. If you could come up here, that would help. We've seen actually a very good example of the impact of globalization, not to make too much of a poignant comment, in Germany's recent elections, where there's been very much a disparity between the old East Germany still and how people voted there versus the old western part of Germany. You know, what do you see as Chancellor Merkel's challenge in that sort of microcosm to deal with the challenges of globalization? Because clearly Germany's made huge strides since the two parts of Germany were brought together, but certainly this election itself would reflect perhaps a judder in that integration of the two parts of Germany.
If I start talking about Chancellor Merkel now, I'm leaving my territory definitely because I'm not a politician.
Well, a wider question on the economy between the two Germanys, really.
I did very well in the last 25 years of my career to stay out of politics because then I can run professional airlines. As a German, I can still have an opinion, and we have seen a very interesting election. Which I think 87% of the Germans are not happy with what the 13% did. And there are reasons for it, there are several reasons for it. East Germany was not used to immigration over the time when it was East German, so that's one of the main reasons. So people there see things differently, and that's why it explains the higher results. But we have to live with it. We're a democracy, and I think we will see now that the new German government will address these issues to have at the next election again a more balanced vote, because I think we're not happy with the development there. But again, I'm not into politics. I have an opinion, but I'm running airlines. So you ask me about tariffs and tickets and stuff, I can't tell you anything.
Okay, well, you gave me a clue with saying you were German, so I couldn't resist that. Okay, so let's open it up to the wider audience. So let's begin with asking questions maybe in two at a time to begin with. So the young gentleman at the front there with the blue shirt.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. The theme was globalization, and I saw yesterday that the European Commission put out a paper on new investments in the eastern neighborhood. And since we are here, I thought that I would like to ask Valdis Dombrovskis, what does it mean? What can we expect? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll take one more question with the gentleman there. Actually, we'll take a cluster of three, I can see.
Thank you very much. Julian Lindley, French. Just to be clear, King Canute tried to hold the tide back to prove the limits of his power.
I know that, yeah.
Which
but people perceive it differently.
Exactly.
You're exactly right. Yeah, I wasn't going to be
observe his limits.
as perfectionist as you, but you're absolutely right.
My question is this. Listening to you speak, if globalization is hurting the bulk of the population so badly, what makes the big G more beneficial to the bulk of the population than protectionism?
And the gentleman there.
Thank you.
From Belgium, I think.
Commander Engelen, Belgian Navy, and also lecturing in international politics here in Riga. My question is about globalization and security. When I look at the Chinese war doctrine, dating back to the 90s, and that war doctrine says that it will resort to 80% of non-military means, and that's their war doctrine. Then I take the advantage of having a politician, a financial, someone from the industry, and someone from the service sector here, to ask them what is their defense doctrine to uphold our social and economic model in the wake of that threat. Thank you.
Okay, maybe we'll begin with Valdis. Do you want to begin?
Indeed. So I'll concentrate on this question on Eastern Partnership and our neighborhood policy in more general terms. Because certainly as European Union in recent years we see that we have quite turbulent neighborhood. We see conflicts and instability in Middle East and Northern Africa, and correspondingly we had seen refugee crisis. We see Russia-Ukraine conflict in eastern neighborhood. So the geopolitical landscape around EU is quite complicated. And that's why it's important that EU uses its resources, its soft power, also its financial support to stabilize the situation in our neighborhood, because at the end of the day it's good for neighborhood and it's good also for the EU. So that's why we had been supporting Ukraine since the beginning of the conflict with 3 consecutive macrofinancial assistance programs. That's why we are now putting forward a macrofinancial assistance program with Georgia. We are running a program also with Moldova, and we will continue this engagement with Eastern Partnership to ensure stability, and also we need to continue to send a signal to Russia that that kind of behavior, changing borders in 21st century Europe by military force, is not acceptable. That's why recently also EU sanctions against Russia were prolonged. So it's, I would say it's a long-term engagement of EU with our Eastern Partnership countries, and we believe it's a mutually beneficial engagement.
Okay, Sergey.
Yeah, I'll probably take the question about the bulk of the population and who does and who does not benefit from globalization. I would start actually with following up what Michael was talking about, and although we probably have very different solutions, I think he's pointing at a very real problem. And this problem is indeed that today in developed countries you have sizable groups of people who lose out of globalization, and telling them that prices are lower is not a great solution, because they see that future is not bright at all. They see no career in front of them, and we have a very real social crisis in the United States, where we have life expectancy among middle income, lower middle income white males and actually females going down. Suicide, stress, drug abuse, opioid epidemics. That is a real social problem, and this is something that we observed in our countries, especially in Ukraine and Russia in early 1990s, and this is not something that we should say is a normal social cohesion outcome. And in that sense, it's a real problem. Now, does that represent majority of population? Of course not. Moreover, does that represent majority of global population? The answer is not. In last 20, 25, 30 years, global inequality, if we consider the world as a country, the global inequality has come down substantially, mostly due to growth in major emerging markets. But of course, within certain countries, including the United States, inequality went up. But does that mean that there is no solution? Does that mean that we cannot design inclusive and fair system? The answer is no, because even within the EU, we have countries which manage to open up in an inclusive way. Can Sweden exist in a protectionist mode? The answer is no. Can Latvia close down and prosper? I think there is not a question at all. So I think it's a very easy debate to have, because either we want to eradicate poverty globally, and the solution is globalization, technological progress, investment throughout the world. If we say no to that, of course, we will stick with millions and hundreds of millions of poor people. By the way, global poverty in early 80s was 40% of global population. Today we are talking about single digit. We are living in very good times if we consider the world. Now, can we design solutions for advanced economies? Yes, probably Michael's solution and my solution would be different. Luckily, we are sitting in a free country and can discuss that.
Anybody have anything to add? So yes.
Sure, yeah, so thanks for clarifying King Canute. I think I get it a little bit more now. So yes, with technology and transportation, globalization happens. My quibble with the term is globalism is sort of the governance of the thing, the governance, you know, integration in a governing sense, and I think we're doing it wrongly. And but we're not going to hold back, you know, technology and transport and that sort of thing. So but it's how you manage it. it could be that the free flow of goods and services is inherently bad for labor because capital can move and labor can't. So capital can arbitrage and always seek the lowest price source and leave others out in the cold. Thus they become low-wage, low-hour workers. That does not necessarily mean that I want to stop globalization, but I think that has to be recognized. I also think people think about trade wrongly. Try thinking about it in 3 tiers. Just try this hat on. The first tier is total volume of trade. The total volume of global trade, no matter which direction. Trade agreements don't matter, tariffs don't matter. It's a matter of whether economies are growing or shrinking in the world. That's where the correlation is. The next tier down is the balance of trade. Are there persistent surplus countries or persistent deficit countries? The international economics textbooks will say that persistent surpluses and deficits can't exist because currencies will adjust. That hasn't happened. We have persistent currency imbalances that are causing big problems where we have some countries over-relying on other countries for growth. But tariffs don't matter to imbalances. If you look around the world and look at high tariff and low tariff countries, you will see no relationship between trade surplus and deficit countries. Or trade agreements don't matter to it either. Lastly is the composition of trade. What are you buying exactly, and what are you producing and exporting? And oh, by the way, your biggest market is usually your domestic market anyway. That's where industrial policy matters, tariffs matter, subsidies, technological comparative advantages God given, that sort of thing. But so that's the way to think about trade. And if I could wave a magic wand right now, I would take currency imbalances across the world and get all currencies into an equilibrium price and smooth out all the global persistent trade imbalances, including the United States, and then let countries work on the composition of trade within their borders.
Thank you. Any more questions? There's one interesting one online that says, I miss Ed Lucas already. Well, I miss him too. Yes, the gentleman back there with a white shirt and blue tie.
Did Lucas work with King Canute somehow? Or?
Sorry. No, that wasn't my question, whoever asked that. Richard Skols, Member of Parliament from Latvia. Well, there's interesting lines coming from you. Just the last person who spoke about the trade agreements doesn't matter. It's only the expanding or shrinking economies. Well, your assessment as a representative from America, the NAFTA as well, well, you make a good comparison with Mexico. They're taking over the factories and so on. So that proved that actually a developing economy took advantage of the trade agreement. So it kind of contradicts what you said, that the trade agreement doesn't work at all. Maybe for somebody that are stronger at that point, maybe it loses. But that is something what the moderator said, that globalization, well, we need to balance that those who are benefiting from globalization in one way are contributing to those who are losers in one way or another. So my question would be for all panelists about the future of enhanced trade agreements, especially if you can focus more on the European ones and how they will improve or the situation globally. And together with the developments in the World Trade Organization, that comes back to moderators' raised question about how we compensate to the losers. And my question about the Doha round, which is something painful for those who maybe are not grasping into these international trade agreements, and it's hard for them to reach. So what would be your solution to go ahead with the Doha round, limiting barriers, transfer of technology, and etc.? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take maybe a question there.
Thank you very much. Zhang Tianze from University College of London, researcher. And first question is for Dr. Sergey. I was wondering that the problem of the European labor market is that due to the shrinking of the economy itself, or is that because of lack of what you mentioned? You should have the more interconnections between the government, public sector, and companies. Do you think which more accounts for more? And the second question is for Mr. Michael. You just said about your two-tier theory of the how we should look at the international trade. I think this is a kind of coverage for the political. On the one hand, you should maintain the total growth. On the other hand, there are some excuses to to keep so-called balances and to do some subsidies, which is usually the government do. So my question is. You mentioned the Mexico, where Mexico is have the cheaper labor, and why should you think that Mexico should convert its salary to the U.S. standards? Or on the other hand, why do you think that U.S. still necessary to keep those low standard positions, those kind of basic job positions for its citizens? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we'll begin, I think, with Valdis. If you start on the Doha question, maybe, and then we'll work across.
Well, so maybe start with a question which was asked also on those enhanced trade agreements, because what we are currently seeing indeed is proliferation of bilateral or regional trade agreements. Well, that's a reality. Given that there's not so much advancement in kind of a global WTO talks. And from the EU side, we take the view that in trade agreements we should not be only discussing trades in goods or services for that sake, but indeed have a more broader scope, including investment protection, public procurement, quality standards, a number of other elements, and that's the approach which we had been taking in our trade agreements. And once again, I would say the recent shift in the tone of the conversation from the US administration has helped to concentrate minds also in Europe, and there is more active engagement. We recently concluded agreement with Canada, and actually this agreement is by now already fully into force. We are working on free trade agreement with Japan. We are starting the work with Australia and New Zealand. We are working with other regions. So I think it's very important that we continue this engagement with the world.
Yeah, I will follow up on this and also answer the question about European job market, because what I'm going to say is going to answer both questions. And I think one of the challenges in Europe is also to create a joint services market. The European common market, single market for services, is not fully complete. If you have a job of a plumber in one country, it's not very easy to move to another country. If you are a professor, it's kind of easier to move as a professor, but moving your pension is already a challenge. Moving your social benefit is a challenge. And this is what Commission is going to work on. And I'm very happy that in addition to working on single capital market, we also talk about jobs union. And indeed, we do have countries in Europe where unemployment is very low, below natural rate, if you like. We have countries where youth unemployment is double digits or above 20%, and in some countries, as you rightly said, even higher. So the question is, can we actually connect the markets, promote mobility, and help people who have the right skills to move more easily? And this is, I think, the most important agenda for trade negotiators. It's not exactly the enhanced trade duties, but this is the spirit of what the Commission should be doing together with the member states. And to follow up on that, I think part of the structural unemployment problem is about inflexible labor markets, and that's why, for example, today in France, there is this debate about reform of labor code, exactly trying to recreate Scandinavia and France, if you like, to create more flexible labor markets so it's easier to create jobs. And that may work, and if that works, we will see a proof that it's not only about growth or recession. It's also about structure of the labor market. And I think it's doable. And again, one reason for optimism is that good examples do exist in Europe. Northern Europe has weathered recession well, and unemployment in some of those countries is actually, as I said, low and even lower than before the crisis.
Okay, Mike, you had a question directed to you.
Sure. Yeah, what's surprised me, I've been in the trade space for about 10 years. It surprises me how the trade economists are impervious to data. It seems to me built on theology, and you may accuse me of the same thing. But let me try to justify my position. The tariffs, again, I challenge you to look at the world and chart which countries have high versus low tariffs and try to make sense out of whether they have a trade surplus or deficit, or that they're growing or shrinking. There's no relationship. And I challenge you to go back to the international economics textbooks and find that these persistent deficits and surpluses, they're not supposed to exist because currencies are supposed to adjust. That's a big issue that our international institutions, which the so-called populists are distrusting, have not paid attention to their jobs. They have to get that right. Now, as to NAFTA, the U.S. went, in 1993 was the big debate on NAFTA in the U.S. Mexico was doing relatively well, and the pro-free traders that just look at exports only and they quote statistics like every $1 billion in exports creates this many jobs, and don't look at how much import displacement kills many jobs. It's no net, it's always gross. But we went from a deficit, a surplus with Mexico in 93 to a big deficit last year. They were the third biggest deficit country. I actually don't think NAFTA caused that deficit. I think it's, I won't go into it, but there's an array of currency valuations. I think it's all based on currency. As to the composition of trade with NAFTA, of Mexico, and by the way, U.S.-Canada trade is quite balanced. We don't have much of a problem there. The composition of trade, most of the trade deficit that we have with NAFTA is number 1 in auto parts and automotive, number 2 in electronics, and number 3 in machinery. Those happen to be jobs that, you know, working class people have. And by the way, in the U.S., 66% of our workforce does not have a 4-year college degree. So you're not going to give them all PhDs and get them to work retraining, you know, in Wall Street next week. You have to find something for them to do, or like I said with the Chinese government example, they'll find a government who can. Now, the thing about Mexico is they didn't really benefit either. We would have expected wage convergence to benefit Mexico, but in 1994, the Mayan Indians came out of the jungle and started the biggest, they said NAFTA is going to be horrible, and they started the biggest guerrilla insurgency in a generation. The Subcomandante Marcos assassinated a presidential candidate in Mexico, and they ended up with a new president who got a love letter from him saying, "Welcome to hell." They devalued the peso, and there was a peso crisis. From America's perspective, the tariff reductions didn't matter because the peso was so low, it was a bigger deal. They never recovered. So wage levels with Mexico are stagnant in real terms. U.S. corn, my dad's a corn farmer, U.S. corn took out millions of Mexican farmers. They dumped them on the job market. They didn't find good jobs, and now, of course, we have drug lord, crony, a problem government right now with drug lords and cartels. And there's no real data that Mexico benefited.
Right, that was interesting. Who else has some questions? The gentleman in the pink tie and the gentleman with the moustache back there.
Thank you. Hamid Lajavardi, American Baltic Investments. My question has to do with leadership in globalization. Since the end of World War II, America created the architecture for globalization, if you will, at least the beginnings of it. But now America says America first. Germany hasn't said it, but Germany is acting like Germany first. In terms of their defense spending, they have one of the lowest unemployment rate. They also are pushing for Nord Stream 2, not really looking at the concerns of many Eastern European countries, including the Baltics. So it's more like Germany first. Now, Russia is more of a spoiler and divider. I'm talking about different potential leaders. China and India, I don't see them really with any vast experience in global leadership. I don't think the world is ready for the leadership. So we're in an intermediate period where I'm kind of perplexed. What's going to happen to leadership of globalization? I must say, in the long run, I think globalization is inevitable. But could you please give me your best wisdom about what's going to happen in the immediate term of globalization?
Yeah, before we get to the gentleman with the moustache, because I know it's going to take a while for the microphone to get back there, that actually ties in with a question that Maya has asked online, is what are the drivers of inclusive globalization? So if we can actually begin with Martin, in response to that question.
In response, I'm not the globalization expert and not a politician, but what I can say on leadership is I heard Germans first. We have the diesel in Germany. So what happened then after the diesel, having the car industry in Germany being first in the world with the best cars? 2 years ago, you wouldn't have had any doubt about that. Now we have electromobility coming. US is leading at the moment with Tesla. And what is happening? Yesterday, China announced, they're going to have a 30% quote for electric cars in 2019. It's the earliest in the world. So there was one tweet saying, we're not talking about the environment here. Globalization also means, and that's an environmental issue, changes are going very fast now because we are global. Yeah? The free trade enables Germans to buy Teslas, and they're buying more Teslas now than the Americans buy Mercedeses, at least in California. But America first, Germany may be still second on this, but China is going to be first 2019 because they have a law saying electric cars 30%. So globalization and leader of globalization will not only be the things we discussed here, it will also be new technology. And we do not know, we can all not imagine what kind of phones or whatever we're going to be using in 10 years. Just take out your old phone from 10 years ago and look at it and look at your iPhone today. So I would say that globalization, leadership, will have to do a lot also with how we live and how the environment is. And we can't say today who is going to be the leader. The diesel has shown us how fast it can go when you are a global leader to not be the leader anymore.
Okay, Valdis, do you want to come in?
Yes, on this, maybe from a slightly different angle. The question is who will lead the globalization, and of course there can be different questions, but the question is, do we really need to search a country name for that? What about looking about strong global institutions? In a multipolar world, strengthening the institutions, international institutions which we have, United Nations, WTO, Bretton Woods institutions, and so on and so forth, because we need those global institutions if we want to move forward. Well, G20 to mention, give some examples. Where do we see, for example, globalization very pronounced is in financial markets. We really can talk about international financial markets. So international financial markets need international rules. We are discussing them in Basel, we are discussing them in Financial Stability Committee, and those are maybe the institutions where we should be discussing and then actually adhering to what has been agreed there. Let's take taxation. One of the kind of grievances about the globalization is that this globalization is creating possibilities to evade taxes. There is an OECD initiative against base erosion and profit shifting. We also, as a European Commission, recently came with proposals in the area of digital taxation to ensure that companies pay taxes where the real economic activity is taking place. But once again, to be successful, we need a global effort. So we need this OECD work. We need a commitment of at least G20 level to be able to successfully enforce it. So maybe we don't only need to look, oh, it's US, it's China, it's maybe EU, but that we need to strengthen the international institutions where we can make those decisions and then stick with them.
Sergey?
Yeah, I generally agree with Valdis, and let me talk about inclusive globalization question, the drivers of inclusive globalization. I think the main driver is, of course, the political push for inclusion and fairness. And the solutions are, again, the ones that we talked about, the lifelong learning, re-education, increased mobility, flexible labor markets, innovation, and so on. And what Valdis just mentioned about fighting tax evasion is also very, very important, because it's not about inequality only. It's also about unfair inequality. We work in countries which started off with nominal equality, where everybody would get the same wage, whether you work hard or not. And people didn't like that. People didn't like unfair equality. And in that sense, as long as inequality is driven by talent and skill and effort, that's fine. As long as inequality is driven by place of birth, gender, ethnicity, race, and political connections, and corruption, that is something that people reject. And initiatives fighting tax shifting, tax evasion, that is one of the initiatives that people actually want to see, because they want to see top income earners paying taxes alongside with the middle class and the poor. And I think this is very important as well.
Okay, Mike, do you think, given the point that was just made by Sergey, that President Trump is going to respond to that inequity in taxation? Is he going to be taxing effectively those at the top end, or is he going to be helping those at the bottom end, like he promised during his election campaign? That's one question. Second question from one of our online people towards you is, aren't dignified working conditions and environmental costs needed principles for inclusive growth?
So on Trump's tax plan, every tax plan I've seen in Washington proposed in the past year has been kind of a big nothing burger, so I don't think it's great. On that, what was the second question?
The second question was, aren't dignified working conditions and environmental costs needed principles for inclusive growth?
Sure. That's a social justice issue primarily, and I think it's a good one. It's not to diminish it by calling it a social justice issue. I think fair labor and good and environmental standards are very important, and they're social justice issues. That's sort of come up in the NAFTA debate in the U.S., where if we have good working conditions in Mexico or again in China, that's a help to their workers. It doesn't necessarily fix the imbalances we've been discussing today, or I've been discussing. There's a question about who's going to be the leader, though, and I think I'd like to make a short response to that. I think we're in an era right now where China's going to be the biggest economy in the world very soon. They already are in purchasing power parity, and they will be in GDP terms soon. And the U.S. will no longer be the biggest economy in the world. We set up the Bretton Woods system. The U.S. was the last man standing after World War II. Everyone, we were the biggest economy. We led. But every time in history you have a changing of the guard, there's going to be some instability. I think we're seeing that right now. And I think the U.S. is worried about the kitchen table issues and about the fact we're stagnating and saying, hey, what do we get out of this global leadership here? We give everything up. We're stagnating. What do we get out of it? We're not so sure we want to do it anymore. And I think it's partly due to that.
Okay, there was the gentleman back there with the moustache. If you can get the microphone to him. Thank you.
My name is Karthik Desai. Chairman of the Board of SIA Baltovens. My focus is on TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Protocol. What is the status? And if it is getting delayed, what are the causes? And how does it affect the EU's economic prospects?
Yeah, good question. So negotiating TTIP is like herding 27 cats, as far as I can see. When President Obama came to Britain prior to Brexit and said you'll go to the back of the queue, I sort of felt that actually doing a deal with the United States once Brexit has happened is going to be easier because it's easier to do a bilateral deal than a multilateral deal. In our collective lifetime, do you ever see a TTIP deal being done? Valdis.
Well, yes, absolutely. Well, as regards TTIP, indeed, it's delayed. We do not see it coming in nearest years. First, it's worth remembering that there was quite a pronounced opposition against TTIP in the EU already before, and with the Trump administration, we also see also quite a negative position towards TTIP from US. So currently, there's not much happening around TTIP. But I may imagine that in a couple of years' time, we may need to take a fresh look, because still we are each other's, US and EU are each other's biggest trading partners, biggest investors. EU is the biggest foreign investor in the US. So it would only make sense that we engage closer economically. So I think this issue will be back on table, and it will be at foreseeable future also concluded.
Okay, Sergey, do you have a comment on that? No? Mike, do you want to say something?
Sure, yeah, there's no economic case for TTIP. There's nothing to do with tariffs in there. It's all about global deregulation. It's all about trying to pull regulatory authority from the nation states up to an international level where citizens can't affect it. And it's all about multinational corporations having more convenience. It's not about domestic economies. It's not about workers. It's all driven by multinational lobbyists. There's no economic case for it.
So really what you're saying is there is, again, another example of a disconnect between what effectively the political class may be seeking and what ordinary people actually want.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that last point. I come from Sheffield, and
so do I.
Oh, good man.
That's Sheffield, Massachusetts.
Are you a United fan or a Wednesday fan?
Well, I don't know. I don't think so.
There you go. Yeah. I take your point about global inequality, but what do you say to a Sheffield steel worker? It's all very well to talk about Sergey, lofty ambitions of solving global inequality. But what do you say to my Sheffield steel worker who's got no hope? It strikes me that we talk about populism. Populism happens because mainstream politicians do not deal with the main concerns of huge numbers of people effectively. So I'd love to get some idea of what you would say to this Sheffield ex-steel worker with no job and not much future.
Actually, can I give the flip side of that coin? Because there's another part of that. Interestingly enough, during the Brexit debate, that I remember an interview up in the Nissan factory up in Sunderland. And people were told that you risk losing your job by both the Chancellor and Nissan if you vote for Brexit, but they still did. So there's a disconnect still beyond even having a job.
Yes, I think it's a very good question, and as I already said, it's a real problem. It is a real problem. So what globalization does and what automation does, it creates a job polarization. People at the top of skill pyramid benefit. Jobs in in Europe are created for engineers, consultants, bankers, lawyers. Jobs are also created at the bottom of skill pyramids. These are low-wage jobs which are not worth automating or outsourcing yet. Now we have a retail crisis in the US as well, where retail jobs get automated, right? And these are the jobs in the middle, which you mentioned, that get either automated or outsourced. And then, of course, globalization and then automation reinforce each other. The more technological progress we observe, the lower our trade barriers in physical terms. And vice versa. The lower our trade barriers, the bigger the potential market, the higher returns to innovation, create more incentives to innovate and come up with a new technology. So this is a process which does create real tensions. Now, what can we suggest to a displaced worker? 45 years, 50 years? That's a very good question. So one thing is this, get a new job, get retrained, and I acknowledge it's very, very hard. Now, what is important is that this person should not die of hunger. And this is, in the West, more or less, is managed reasonably well. We don't have mass famine in Western societies. There is a debate to what extent we should go to universal basic income, where this universal basic income should be, at which level, but that is a different debate. Another question is the kid of this worker should get access to good education and healthcare and good job. This is what matters to this worker. And this is what is done in Nordic countries. Whoever your parents are, wherever you're born, education is more or less accessible, which means careers are also accessible. Nowhere we have equal opportunity. And this is also normal because as a parent, I like my kid to succeed. And if I know that my kid is taken away from my family and all kids get equal starting conditions, of course, that will destroy my incentives to work hard as well. That's for sure. But yet, the very fact that Swedish kids are more or less getting access to good education, French kids have access to good public schools, that is something of a consolation. This is part of the solution. And this is, again, not easy, but something that has to be done. And same with healthcare. Displaced workers deserve dignity in terms of getting good healthcare, as well as top 1% from the Wall Street. I think these are top issues which should not be put under the rug.
Yeah. So what I would say is since Brexit, the pound has devalued. It was overvalued before. It's devalued now, making British labor, goods and services more competitive than it was. So that Sheffield steel worker who is in a very innovative metallurgical industry, doing a job in the same industry by name, but a very different job than he used to, is doing better than he is before. Number two, because of the new form of state-directed capitalism, in this case in Asia, where they have built on state-subsidized, state-owned capacity far beyond anything the market would ever demand, that they should get the UK government to be very aggressive in using the international trade rules to use countervailing duties, to use quotas, to do whatever, so that you can offset the impact of those subsidies in the product dumping that have caused a glut of steel in the world.
Yeah, it's particular types of steel, but you're absolutely right. Okay, we're sort of in the home straight now, which is 5 more minutes. So one of our tweeters here has asked a very poignant question. He feels that we have not actually answered the question. So given all the comments that we've had here, given the comments you've heard from each other, can you spend no more than 60 seconds each answering this question? Is the end of globalization looming ahead? And we'll begin with Martin.
Not at all. I think we will all see, as we have seen in the last 3,000 years, a continuous improvement, and the technologies coming and the globalization will help to make the world a better place in all areas.
Okay. Michael?
No, it's not looming. Globalization through the global integration is technology, transportation is going to continue. We're at an inflection point as to how we manage it.
Okay.
I'm optimistic. I think solutions exist, but if we don't implement those solutions, then we may actually face backlash. But overall, I'm optimistic. I think we will see better, smarter globalization.
Right, that's sort of actually a continued backlash. Okay, and finally, Valdis?
Indeed.
You can spend a bit longer because we have at least 3 minutes here.
Indeed, one can expect that globalization will continue. If we had seen over the last couple of decades, in 1970s, trade was around 20% of the global GDP. Now it's around half, and tendencies like technological change, like digitalization, it will only reinforce globalization. So the real question is indeed how we reap the benefits of globalization and how we address the challenges of globalization and how we address some of the inequalities which may be a result of globalization. I think those are the key issues to concentrate on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. If you could all join me in thanking our panelists and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.